Alright, so let's take a look quickly at kind of what happens in Europe after World War II, after the world tries to rebuild from the devastation caused by the war, the turmoil and all the upheaval as a result not just of the war, but the totalitarianism of Hitler, Mussolini, and even Stalin. So to kind of get there, we're going to have to take a quick step back and look at the formation of what's known as the Big Three, right? And that's the three main diplomatic players at the end of World War II. So these big three come from the members of the Grand Alliance. Again, Great Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union. From Great Britain is their greatest statesman, Winston Churchill. The leader of the United States at the time is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And for the Soviet Union, it's Joseph Stalin. Now, it's worth noting that both Roosevelt and Churchill hated Stalin, and they weren't particularly fond of each other either. But together they're called the Big Three because these are the three most important people who are involved in kind of determining what post-war Europe is going to look like. And they first meet in Tehran in 1943 when the war is going on. And there they affirm their commitment to defeating Germany. So they had already decided that when the United States entered the war and they started their alliance. But now they reaffirm that and say, yes, our main goal is to defeat Italy. It is at this meeting that they agree that the United States and Great Britain will launch a joint attack through France and then against Germany. Originally, Great Britain had wanted to attack through the Balkan regions, through Greece, and they in fact do some diversionary action to convince the Germans that that's where they're going. But it is here that they agree that they will land at Normandy after they've already started their launch up through Italy. So this is kind of the formation of these big three as an alliance. And at the Yalta Conference, again, this is right before the war ends. They meet at Yalta in February of 1945. And again, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin are the big three. And they meet there to kind of discuss what the world is going to look like, particularly what Europe is going to look like after the war. And because of the way the war was working out, the Soviet Union was in a much stronger position for these negotiations. They had pushed the German army back. They were closing in on Berlin. Meanwhile, the United States and Great Britain were kind of struggling against the onslaught of the Germans. They had just recently launched some attacks against them, and the United States was still struggling to kind of island hop their way through the Pacific to defeat Japan. So the Soviets were in a stronger position, and so they kind of hold the upper hand in negotiating. At this meeting, at this conference, they create a plan to structure post-war Europe. The first thing they decide is they're going to divide Germany into 4 different zones of occupation. So each country, and the 4th country here is going to be France, although Charles de Gaulle, who's the leader of the Free French government, is not one of the big three. He's an important player. They decided they're going to divide Germany into 4 different zones of occupation, and then they're going to subdivide Berlin into 4 different zones. And that looks kind of weird, and will have ramifications later. And then they decide that the Eastern European countries will have free elections, but they would be pro-Soviet. So they agree that these countries would help the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union's afraid of an aggressive Germany. Just like France was after the Treaty of Versailles, they were afraid of an aggressive Germany. And then the last thing is they decide to agree, the Soviets agree to declare war on Japan after Hitler had been defeated. They had not declared war yet due to pre-existing non-aggression pact they had with Japan. So that's Yalta. And here you see the division of Germany. So this is all Germany. The green belongs to the United Kingdom, Great Britain, the blue to France, the yellow to the United States, the red to the Soviet Union. And you see here, this is the kind of Berlin area. It's the city of Berlin. And you see it's subdivided into different categories. So each country is responsible for taking over that section and occupying it after the war and redeveloping and getting it going. Eventually we'll see a breakdown into what's known as West Germany and East Germany that's not reunited until significantly later down the line. The Yalta Agreement fails in large part because Bulgaria and Poland were occupied by the Red Army, the Soviet Army, and they were controlled by the communists, and so it was time for them to go to have these free democratic elections. And the Red Army and communists say, no, we think we'll just stay here. This is a good place as any for us, so we'll park it here. And so you see the creation of multiple governments throughout Eastern Europe that are definitely pro-Soviet, and not only are they pro-Soviet, which probably wouldn't have been that big of an issue, but you actually see people from Moscow getting appointments to run these governments. So they're in fact serving as just kind of branches of Stalin's government operating in various countries, all reporting back to him. And the Western powers don't like this. They're afraid of communism. They're afraid of Stalin's reach and his influence. And so they kind of are frustrated by this, and we see tensions start to rise because of this. There's a meeting after the war, or after Germany's been defeated, in Potsdam. And this time, it's Churchill, Truman, and Stalin. Roosevelt has died at this point, and so Truman is now representing the United States as he comes into this. And this is a different shift. Roosevelt was much more of a statesman than Truman was, and was a better negotiator. But, I mean, the things were going to end the way they were going to end. At this meeting in Potsdam, Truman refused, or he demanded the free elections throughout Eastern Europe. He refused to buy into these kind of Red Army overseen elections. He realized that they were a farce, and he demanded that those be changed with real free elections. And Stalin flatly refuses to do so. He says, this is the way things are going to go. You're just going to have to deal with it. And as allies, there's not really a lot that Truman can do to enforce what he's feeling. And so it's at this moment that we really begin to see the tensions that lead to the Cold War. And this is kind of, I guess, where the Cold War begins, although it's really hard to pin it at this moment. But at Potsdam, the kind of working relationship between these three great powers falls apart. And that's because they've defeated Hitler. So Hitler was their unifying force. They may not like each other, but they definitely hated Hitler more. Once he's defeated, they begin to fight against each other. So, as I said, tensions begin to flare after this. The United States demanded that these elections be held, and be held freely, insisting that they would not recognize any government that was not created with free elections, which is ironic as we move forward. But they refused to recognize governments that are forced into existence. And to make their point, they cut off all aid to the Soviet Union. You'll recall that one of the contingencies of this big alliance, of this grand alliance, was that the United States provided material and monetary aid to not just Great Britain, but to the Soviet Union as well. And so the United States, in response to the Soviet Union's imposing of certain governments, cuts off that aid. In response to this, Stalin commands the communist parties in France and Italy and his kind of incognito operatives there to undertake subversive actions. And so they, in the Communist Party in those countries, lead strikes and violence and massive protests against their government. And so that kind of undermines the French and Italian democracy. And they blame the United States for it. These communist parties keep uncovering evidence of the United States trying to take control, as they call it. And so they respond with strikes and violence. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union is supporting communist movements in Iran, Turkey, Greece, and China. All around the world, they're supporting these communist parties with military aid, with money, with tacit support in a variety of different ways. So we have this moment of distrust right when the war ends, where communists think that Americans are trying to take over Europe and trying to exert too much influence. And the Americans think that Stalin is trying to force communism on Europe and the rest of the world. They think that he's finally shifted away from his communism in one country to an international communist movement. And this terrifies them. This is what they thought the biggest fear, the biggest threat to their existence would be, is this threat of communism. So you see these tensions building. But because they just come out of a war, neither side's really interested in pressing things too far. And so the United States ends up adopting something called the Truman Doctrine. And Truman says that they will contain communism to where it already was. So they recognized that they couldn't roll back communism out of Russia or areas that were occupied by the Red Army. That is Eastern Europe. But their goal was to funnel any money, weapons, any kind of support that was necessary, including the United States Army, to areas to prevent future expansion of communism. And so Truman argues that free people should resist subjugation from outside influence. Again, this is super ironic considering the United States ends up subjugating free peoples with their outside influence. But as long as they were resisting communism, that's truly all that Truman cared about. And so he decided he would do so by granting military aid, and he begins with massive amounts of military aid to both Greece and Turkey, which are in the middle of kind of civil wars pitting communists against non-communist groups. And so he funnels tons of money in there to prevent and stem the tide of communism from spreading. And then another thing that the Americans do to provide a buffer against the spread of communism is what's known as the Marshall Plan. You got to remember that after World War II, Europe was completely destroyed. There's been bombing raids on all major cities. There had been, troops moving back and forth, scorching the countryside. The European continent was in shambles. And so, under the Marshall Plan, the United States would offer economic help to European nations to help them rebuild. And so, the United States offers $13 billion in aid to help rebuild Europe, recognizing that if Europe was strengthened, it would strengthen the American economy, but also, if you funnel money into a country, you will increase the quality of living and people will be less inclined to look to communism as a solution. So it's really a political move more than it is, it's humanitarian, but it's also political, and recognizing that if they funnel money into these governments, they will be kind of in debt to America in terms of owing gratitude and providing a stalwart against communism expansion. So they give $13 billion in aid to Europe, but importantly here is that Stalin refuses to allow any Eastern European nations to accept that aid. So for a long time after the war, Western Europe is significantly more developed and rebuilt than Eastern Europe, simply because there's this huge influx in money that comes into Western Europe that does not go into Eastern Europe. Again, tensions continue to rise. The Soviets not only take over areas where their army was, but they invaded and seized power in all remaining non-communist Eastern European states. So they sent their Red Army through in the idea of quelling kind of any riots, but with the real goal of trying to expand their influence, to create a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. As kind of this tit for tat that they're playing and kind of trying to one-up each other, Stalin eventually blocks all traffic through Soviet Union zones of control to Berlin. Remember that Berlin was kind of this island that was part American, part French, part British, and part Soviet. And so the Soviets, they block all traffic that would allow any supplies to get to Berlin. And so the Western powers have to find ways of getting supplies into West Berlin in order to support the people that they're trying to protect. And so the result is something known as the Berlin Airlift, where hundreds of flights per day take place for 325 days from 1948 to 1949 to bring in supplies. And I mean to bring in any sorts of supplies, water, food, medicine, anything that could be needed by those enclaves in Berlin that were surrounded by Soviet influence. And so this is truly a massive undertaking. When you're talking hundreds of flights a day, you have planes landing constantly, every few minutes, and needing to kind of run through and out. It's a massive undertaking, and eventually the Soviets kind of back down and allow convoys to continue through Soviet zones of influence to allow deliveries through traditional methods, trucking, instead of through airplanes. The United States and Western powers, fearful of the Soviet Union, create a military alliance known as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, in 1949, and that's an anti-Soviet military alliance. So basically, all of Western Europe and the United States and Canada enter this alliance and say, if any country is attacked by the Soviet Union, all of us will go to war against them. The idea here, of course, was to protect those Western countries from potential invasion. Recalling that the Red Army was massive at this time and could have ruled through any of those independent nations single-handedly, so they needed the support of everybody else. In response, the Soviet Union created something called Warsaw Pact in 1955, and that's a military alliance of Eastern European nations against the Western powers, against NATO. And this really leads us to the Cold War and the Cold War showdown. And it splits the world into two spheres of influence, that of the NATO, which is the blue on this map, and the Warsaw Pact, which is the red. You have some nations that are non-aligned, and you have some that are communist, and then you have the capitalist. And it is from this that we get the terminology first, second, and third world. The first world would have been the capitalists under NATO. The second world would have been the communists, and the third world was any non-aligned nations. And that has since switched to kind of mean something different in terms of its economic potential. So you see that most of Europe is choosing sides, the ones that sit out, Ireland, Sweden, Finland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. And Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia are communists, but their leaders don't particularly get along with the Soviet leaders, and so they stay non-aligned. So that is kind of the development at the beginning of the Cold War and the political and military implications. Now we're going to look at some other changes in Western Europe as a result of World War II. So in terms of politics, the economy is in shambles, and that really, again, the economy being totally destroyed and really kind of Europe being totally destroyed sets the stage for all of this politics. And of course, the hardest hit is Germany due to massive aerial campaigns, including some really brutal bombings, most notably the firebombing of the industrial city of Dresden, which kills tens of thousands of civilians. And so Germany is absolutely in shambles, but so is France and Great Britain. I mean, Britain underwent the Battle of Britain, which was, months of constant bombardment. So these countries were in shambles. And so they looked to new ideas to handle the challenges they face. And one of the most popular political groups that emerges across Europe is a group known as the Christian Democrats. And they are a powerful political force. They are progressive Christians and Catholics. They win elections in France, Italy, and Germany. They reject the ultra-authoritarianism and ultra-nationalism that had bred the likes of Hitler and Mussolini. And so it shouldn't come as a surprise that they're winning in the countries where those two men were in power. It's a full rejection of their ideology. And instead they place their faith in the idea of democracy and cooperation. And that will show up in kind of international politics in this effort to create a European nation. In addition to these Christian Democrats, though, you have really huge success and growth from socialists and communists. Because they were the main resistors during the war, they earned a lot of respect from a lot of people. Also, it was something new to try that could have been better than the alternative, which had led them to two different world wars. On top of that, we have some serious economic changes. And again, you could kind of see these as being intertwined. But in Europe, you see the move to a welfare state. And across the country, across the continent, massive welfare programs are put into place, which are family allowances. For having more children, you get some more tax breaks. Universal health care, health insurance, public housing. Things of these sorts are developed and implemented in Europe in the 1940s and 50s. Many industries are nationalized because there simply isn't the capital initially to get them up and running by private companies, so they need to be nationalized. The U.S. aid from the Marshall Plan is a huge stimulus to the economy, and without that, the European economy would not have developed and restored itself nearly as quickly as it did. That was a huge catalyst. Also, though, is the Korean War in the 1950s, which provides an economic boost because wars always create money and job opportunities. So that's what we have going on. And European nations at this time turn to Keynesian economics. They really look to the ideas of John Maynard Keynes as being crucial to their understanding of how to fix things. And so Keynes argues for a mixed economy, where he argues that there should be a lot of private held industry, but also some national level government policy directives. Because he argues that on a micro level, on individual business levels, everyone's looking to make the most money. And that's acceptable, but that sometimes creates long-term economic problems, which we had seen in the Great Depression and in the pre-World War I economics. And so Keynes says, in order to kind of manage that risk and to provide more general economic growth for all sectors, there should be some government involvement in setting economic plans and economic guides. So the brunt of it should be on the private sector, but the public sector should take a huge role in kind of guiding the economy. And European nations really turned to Keynesian economics as their kind of driving force, and that lasts up through the 70s, and there's a resurgence of it here now. At the same time all this is happening, that idea of a cooperative spirit is really kind of growing in the minds of Europeans. A lot of them believed that they as a continent needed to work together to avoid another world war. And you've got to think that in the span of 30 years, they had seen such utter devastation. And so they really thought, okay, we need to figure out how we can prevent this from happening again. And so that would also not only prevent a world war, but it would also allow Europeans to have more influence in the world as a kind of large nation. And so in order to do this, they create two different groups: the Organization of European Economic Cooperation, and that's kind of a forerunner to some of the other things we'll look at more closely, and then what's known as the Council of Europe, which is a forerunner to what's known as now the European Union. And the Council of Europe, it never really gets off the ground, but it's this idea where there's a European Parliament where representatives from each country would be there to make decisions on a continent-wide scale in order to kind of stave off any frustrations, any tensions, and any possibility of war. This is kind of initially blocked by Britain, who wants to go back to their splendid isolation and leave the continent alone. It just doesn't gain enough traction yet, but eventually that Council of Europe will morph into what we know as the EU. Economic cooperation really grows, so in addition to that OEEC, 6 other nations organized to create what's known as the Coal and Steel Community, and they decide that they're going to regulate and set like a international standard for the coal and steel industry throughout Europe. And together they'd regulate taxes on it and kind of the way it was mined and supplies and things of that sort. So it was nationalized in a sense, but through this international organization. These nations later created what's known as the Common Market, which is also kind of a forerunner to the EU. And they do that at the Treaty of Rome in 1957. And the Common Market reduces all tariffs to create a single European market, and it allows free movement of capital and labor. So people within the Common Market could move from country to country to do different work, and they didn't have restrictions based off nationality because they belonged to the Common Market. The eventual idea was that these nations would work together to create common economic policies and institutions that would kind of guide the way for European economics as a whole. And then all of Europe would see this growth. And they started in the coal and steel industries, and then they move forward to larger things. Then the last thing that we see, the last real major shift, is kind of what's known as de-colonization. But you could see it as a shift in colonization. It's probably a better way of viewing it instead of decolonizing. Because these Western European countries are so weakened by World War II, they're unable to hold on to their colonies. These colonies had fought for them in World War I. Some of them had fought for them in World War II. But now we see the rise of nationalism and demands for self-determination, especially in the wake of World War I, when the victors had talked a lot about self-determination, but they didn't grant it to any colonies. They only granted it to Europeans. And so we see massive independent movements across all colonies. And so that's one of the factors. Again, the other one is that Europeans simply couldn't hold on to it after being defeated. And then most of the Asian colonies have been taken away through Japanese conquest. And then when the Americans come through and liberate those, they generally are granting freedom. When European nations decided that they wanted to hold on to countries and colonies, they ended up finding themselves in long, protracted struggles that just never ended well. They were bloody, they were messy. These colonists were fighting for their independence on their home turf. And so Europeans quickly realized that instead of fighting them for military and political control, they could use these countries and gain from them economically and use them to boost European economy. And so they grant independence in order to develop these nations as trade markets and in order to exploit them for their raw materials through negotiating kind of not so savory trade deals with the people in power, and then providing the people in power with guns and things of that sort to keep them in power. And this is what's known as neocolonialism or new colonialism. And that's why I suggested that it's a shift. It's not a decolonization, but it's a shift in the way colonization happens. So neocolonialism is this system, and it really still exists today, where Western economic dominance is maintained over their former colonies. That those former colonies, the rulers there, are propped up by interests from Western European countries, by their money, by their weapons, and even sometimes by their military. And in return, companies from those countries get access to raw materials for a cheap price and can then sell their goods into those markets. And so this really forces those colonies into economic subordination and submission. And those colonies don't have the opportunity to grow and develop because the corruption is at all levels, but especially those who have the power in those countries are so corrupt that instead of forcing their country to industrialize and develop, they just pocket bribes and keep their country the way they are. And so the result of this is that Europeans maintain almost total control over sub-Saharan Africa. And the United States is involved in this as well, but since we're looking at European nations, it's sub-Saharan Africa and somewhat the Middle East and Southern Asia for a while. And so that sub-Saharan African domination continues until this day. So we see this real shift in European view as a result of World War II.